I'm keeping on that reading my feet when I'm there, I've been showing this one. And like that's it, one off. Lo immigrazione di mettere a microfono di lo vai a fare immigrazione con una principale Daniel capo de fare la lasce. If you have it, you have the original. Vediamo tempo, just scroll with the mouse. There's a mouse.
Yeah, but it just was very interesting. I wanted to ask a question the other day.
We don't have any more handouts, so if you're sitting next to somebody who has, then we'll be.
Welcome to the sixth session, Recovering Phoenician Oral Poetry. We have three papers givers. The first one, Professor Edward Greenstein from Bar-Ilan University. And he will speak about wisdom seeing in Northwest Semitic epigraphy. Professor Greenstein.
So I speak into this, yes? Okay. And we'll just see. Okay, good. You can see by the crossout that I planned this for the conference when it was supposed to originally take place in June. But I'm glad that we're all here today. And it's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Wisdom sayings in Northwest Semitic epigraphy. I'll be focusing, though, on Phoenician. Amari proverb is the first text, but I know that it's not Phoenician. Okay. Until relatively recently, scholars presumed that apart from the Aramaic proverbs of Achikar, there was virtually no wisdom literature among the known texts written in the areas neighboring Israel. In terms of bulk, it is certainly true that no country in the Levant, apart from Israel, produced a significant amount of what we call wisdom literature. Nevertheless, William F. Albright had many decades ago suggested that the Phoenicians possessed a legacy of wisdom. And I endeavored to indicate several years ago in the Hunegard Festschrift that the Ugaritic texts, and not just the Akkadian texts found at Rosh Hashanah, incorporated passages, themes, and motifs that represent wisdom. It has long been observed that the scribes writing letters in Syria and Canaan in the second millennium would sometimes spice up their texts with proverbial sayings. Proverbs in the correspondences found at Mari in eastern Syria and Elamarna in central Egypt have been collected in scholarly publications. For example, the Assyrian king Shamshi Adad, after taking over Syria, placed his son Yasmach Adu, on the throne of Mari. In one of his letters, Shamshi Adad cautions his son as follows: "On no account should it happen, as the old proverb says, the bitch in her haste gave birth to blind puppies. You should act appropriately. On no account should the enemy maneuver you into an ambush." As Moran has indicated, virtually the same proverb appears over a millennium later in the 5th century Athenian playwright Aristophanes' comedy called Peace. The bitch in her haste gives birth to the blind. Closer in time and place to Israel, the governor of Shechem, Labayu, in the mid-14th century, inserts what appears to many as a proverbial saying in this Amarna letter: "When an ant is smitten, does it not fight back and bite the hand of the man who smote it?" Anglophones like me will find a kinship between this saying and the still contemporary epigram warning that people should not bite the hand of the one who feeds them. This saying, comparing the exceptional and unnatural behavior of a dog who tends not to bite the hand of the one who feeds it, may trace back to Aesop's 6th century BCE fable in which a man bitten by a dog seeks a cure. The proverbial saying, used and reused by Rib Hadi of Byblos in the Amarna correspondence, "My field, for lack of plowing, is like a woman without a husband," has been shown by David Marcus in the Gaster Festschrift to have widespread parallels. Proverbs embedded in more prosaic texts can often be identified by their repetition and occurrence in various, often widespread versions. They often stand out in their rhetoric from the surrounding text, for example, either in the form of an analogy or in parallelism. They are ordinarily expressed in full sentences, and they are often formulated in the third person as though they are being quoted from another source. Almost 20 years ago, when I began looking for proverbial sayings in Northwest Semitic inscriptions, I thought I would find several. Although there are quite a number of rhetorical flourishes in the inscriptions, some of them with parallels in the Hebrew Bible or in other literatures, I was disappointed to find only 2 good examples of wisdom in this corpus, both of them in Phoenician inscriptions. Later on, I will suggest there may be others. The Phoenician inscription of Kilamua of Samal, or Yahudi, his other inscription is in Samalian, is a rhetorical tour de force in which the king boasts that he has outstripped all his predecessors, including his father and presumably older brother, by fending off their regional enemies. However, in order to combat the powerful Danunians from southern Anatolia, Kilamua enlisted the aid of the king of Assyria. Kilamua then reports, "One would have to pay a maiden for a sheep and a manservant for a garment." The statement has every marking of a proverb. It is a complete sentence. It is formulated in parallel clauses. So are many other passages in the inscription. However, as Michael O'Connor keenly discerned, this is the only instance in which the verb is deleted in the second of the parallel clauses, a routine feature of West Semitic verse. The statement describes the grammatical subject in the third person, and there are numerous parallels to the general concept and the specific form of what many, including H.L. Ginsberg, Franz Rosenthal, John Gibson, and Yitzhak Avishur, regard as a proverb. 2 examples from the Hebrew Bible are Joel 4:3 and Proverbs 6:29. I think that's a mistake in the handout, but you can check. Won't be the last mistake in a hymn. They paid a boy for a prostitute and a girl they sold for wine, and then they drank it. For a female prostitute, one pays as little as a loaf of bread, but a man's wife will cost you your precious life. In the first example, people would barter a child for an object of pleasure. And in the second, the contrast is made between the small price one must pay for hiring a working girl and the enormous price one must pay for hiring another man's wife. On the handout, you will find additional examples from Mesopotamia and Egypt, in which a dramatic change of fortune will have a corresponding impact on the market. Phoenician, admonitions of Ipuwer, Ashurbanipal's boast. Returning to Kilamua's proverbial saying, because the verb yud tav nun can be interpreted, I would say yatinu, it can be interpreted as a singular or plural, as active or as passive. The sense is potentially ambiguous. Who is the subject and what is the sense? Some propose that it refers to the depressed economy that preceded Kilamua's provision of security to his area. Previously, one had to pay dearly for sheep and clothing. However, as Kilamua writes in the second part of his inscription below, I made a man who had never seen an ox's face the owner of a herd of cattle, and an owner of silver, an owner of gold. We find a similar sentiment in the largest inscription of Azatiwara of Adana, who claims to have brought an abundance of food and prosperity to the people of his land. However, it should be borne in mind that the description of the post-triumph economy of Samal under Kilamua, in contrast to what the proverb might mean, is elaborate and not at all ambiguous, and that it is presented in a different part of the inscription, following a completely new opening below a thick line dividing the inscription into two. Ginsburg suggests that the subject of the proverb is the king of the Dodonians, who lost the battle and had to pay in human coin for common commodities like sheep and clothing. Regarding the context, the sentence may be referring to the king of Assyria, who generously provided assistance to Kilamua at a low cost. However, in keeping with the rhetorical thrust of the inscription, which deals repeatedly with the actions that Kilamua had taken, and in accordance with the typical proverb in which the subject is not a particular person but a third person in general, I am with those who understand the saying in the following way. Referring to someone in his own position, someone who needed to hire an overlord, the king of Assyria, in order to help him out of a jam, Kilamua is saying that someone who purchases the assistance of a powerful ally needs to pay dearly. One would have to pay a maiden for a sheep and a manservant for a garment. The price of protection is steep, but what can you do? When you are desperate for aid, you pay what you must. Asatiwara of Adana was apparently the regent of the king, who was probably still young to govern on his own, but he took responsibility for providing security and prosperity to his realm. In his large building inscription, which was inscribed in the city gate in 5 versions, 2 in the local Luwian language and 3 in the cosmopolitan language of Standard Phoenician. Azatiwara boasts of building fortresses, subduing gangs, and of mixing the population so that law and order would prevail. In order to make his achievement vivid, he cites an apparent proverbial saying, and in places which were previously dreaded, in which a man would dread walking the road, in my days, a woman would walk alone with her spindles. The description of the woman walking alone with her weaving, a spindle in each hand and strands of wool between them, can be identified as a traditional saying. It is formulated in a sentence and in the third person, and it contrasts directly with the earlier situation in which even a man, presumably less vulnerable to attack, would have dreaded to walk alone. Moreover, the situation of gangs threatening the safety of travelers is described in the Egyptian admonitions of Ipuwer, and in the Persian period in Xenophon's Anabasis. That this description belongs to a traditional saying is supported by the fact that it is employed more than a millennium earlier by Shulgi, king of Ur. I made them dwell in teeming places and peaceful habitations. As for their men and women, their man goes wherever he wishes, and the woman holds spindles and needles, wandering on whatever roads they wish. It may be overreaching to claim that this verbal image is at bottom wisdom, but in the sense that all proverbial discourse is sapiential, part of the trained scribe's toolkit, the statement may be counted as wisdom. As mentioned above, Northwest Semitic epigraphy features not a few rhetorical flourishes. One of the best known is Eshmunazar of Sidon's curse on those who would open, pillage, or move his body from his fancy Egyptian manufactured coffin. May they have no stock below or boughs above, nor resplendence in life under the sun. The curse formula in which this particular execration is embedded is conventional, with parallels in classic Babylonian inscriptions on the vertical axis and parallels among the Northwest Semitic inscriptions on the horizontal axis. The second part of Eshmunazar's curse echoes his father's threat against anyone who would open his sarcophagus. That's in Tabni. May you have no seed in life under the sun. The specific image in the first part of the cited curse of Eshmunazar's has clear parallels in the Hebrew Bible and in Ben Sira, as Ginsburg pointed out in a well-known article. Thus, for example, the prophet Amos says, and here I correct the translation on the handout a little bit, Amos says that the Lord exterminated the Amorites in their entirety. I wiped out his boughs above and his roots below. I suspect that the original reading of Shin Resh Shin Vav was the singular, its trunk, and not the plural, its roots. Originally, they would have been written the same. Shalom Paul, in his Amos commentary, renders his boughs above and his trunk below. The image is, of course, that of a tree. As in children's drawings, the tree has two visible parts, the trunk, which children tend to paint brown, and the leafy boughs, which the children tend to paint green. As Ginsburg convincingly argued, the term shoresh in the singular refers not to the invisible roots of the tree, but to the above-ground shaft, the trunk. See also the examples on the handout from Isaiah 37 and Ben Sira 23. The representation of a whole by naming its parts is evident in the only way that biblical Hebrew can express the world, the concept the world, by naming Shamayim va'aretz. Everything above the horizon is the sky, and everything below it is the land. A variation on the conventional image is found in Job 18, where Bildad assures Job that the wicked will ultimately receive their just deserts. Below, his roots will dry out, and above, his foliage will wither. Here, the plural shoashim refers to the underground roots, because the image is not one of obliterating the tree, but rather one of drying it up, bottom and top, by cutting off its source of water. That image in Job is related to the wisdom metaphor found in Psalm 1 and Jeremiah 17, in which the righteous are a tree irrigated by the divine water of life, while the wicked are cut off from the source of life. The final Northwest Semitic inscription I will mention is the very well-known Gezer calendar. It has long been thought, as Albright had suggested, that it is a poem dividing the 12-month year into 7 periods of consecutive agricultural activity. The text appears to belong to the genre of what has been called the Sumerian Farmer's Almanac, although it does not resemble the much earlier Sumerian work in structure and detail. But the Farmer's Almanac definitely is wisdom literature. It's a father teaching his son. A text that is closer in form to that of the Gezer calendar is the Bedouin rhyming proverb. When the Pleiades appear, it is time to sow. In the 5th month, the annual plants dry up. Of course, it rhymes in the Palestinian Arabic. Please see the handout. If the Gezer calendar too belongs to the realm of the proverbial and to a scribal school to boot, we may conclude that it too is a work of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you for this. While you were reading those wisdom sentences, it reminded me of two texts in Egyptian. One is the Israel Stela, where you have very similar, you call it a proverb. It would surprise me that it is a proverb in Egyptian, where the situation is so peaceful that a woman can walk alone. So that is in the Israel Stela, in the Libyan part. And the other one is in the Pianchi Stela, where also there's mention of cutting down the fruit and down. So both
In the trunk, you mean?
yeah, the trunk.
Okay. Yes, there are other parallels in Hebrew also, but we're using different vocabulary.
But that's West Semitic, and this is
I understand. I appreciate that. I have written both the examples down. Thank you very much, Daniel.
More questions?
Thank you so much. Just a question. Is women walking around with spindles? I mean, spindles are a feminine attribute. So,
Yes.
so in magic rituals, I mean, you turn men to women by taking weapons and giving them spindles.
Yes.
But why mentioning here? Because it's obvious that even women can walk. That's enough. Why the spindles?
Oh, because that's what women do, right? They can sit walking, but the point I think here is to exaggerate. First of all, I know that in Hittite literature, there's a whole article about it that I read about the spindles as a sign of women's activity. You could say we're associated with women, but that author doesn't include this material at all. But yes, I think that because there's hyperbole here, or let's say taking it to the extreme. In other words, there's so much law and order that a woman could walk, right? Not just a man, but a woman could walk with her spindles, and she wouldn't have to even pay attention to anything else. She wouldn't have to worry. She would just have to worry about, stones on the path so she doesn't trip. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Not really a question, just a comment on that passage. As you well know, it's bilingual, and the Luvian reinforces that and actually shows the meaning
Yes.
to be spindle, because
Yes,
there's a whole history of the interpretation of the term prior to the decipherment of Luvian. So so the Luvian reinforces that.
Yes. Not only did I read Brown's book when it came out, but I even reviewed it. It was my first, I think, professional review in JOS, 1980 or something like that. But yes, thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ed. I was wondering if you would be willing to speculate a little bit about the social context. I'll start with something more basic. There's a difference between the first cases and the Gezer tablet, of course, in terms of the genre and the literary nature of the text. So I was wondering if you could speculate, now I get back to the point, about the social context in which the Gezer tablet has been composed, because if it is a poem, or a song, and if it is so ingrained in the cultural, let's say, of the agricultural context, who would write it? Why in this form? What does it tell us about the wisdom literature, let's say in more general terms?
Thank you. I believe that Aaron Dembski claimed many years ago that that Gezer was probably the site of a scribal school or something like that because it was a Levitical town. Okay. In addition, if I'm not mistaken, and it's possible that I've been known to make a mistake once in a while, that I believe that the Gezer, the stone on which the Gezer calendar was written, was erased, and then it was written over. So I think that this was a scribal exercise given to a student, who then had to write the exercise, and that I think immediately associates it with the potential, at least, of being wisdom, because wisdom is scribal, etc.
Michael? No.
Thank you so much for this fascinating work. I would just add with the Gezer calendar that perhaps it was also a learning exercise, because ingraining this proverb, in future generations was so important for feeding the city.
Yeah, I assume that that most of whoever wrote this inscription was just one of many, and that everybody learned from their families what they had to do agriculturally, but that this particular text was a ditty, you might say, has been said, that was meant to engage a relatively young student.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a suggestion, which is not necessary at all for your paper, but since you have genre-wise diverse material, if you want to point out what is a proper proverb, you may try to see if there's a deep structure of a conditional. All proper proverbs are basically constructed on a deep structure of conditional, an if-then sentence.
Thank you. What I've read about Proverbs, finds a number of different, deep structures. That analogy being, of course, the most prevalent, I think. But cause and effect is what you're suggesting. Cause and effect, of course, is one. If you dig a pit, to dismay your unkind neighbor, you may fall into it yourself, etc. Yes, thank you.
Sometimes the structure is not in the text.
Right. Right, thank you.
Just here. Again, thanks for a fascinating talk and important, certainly important research. Also on the question of genre and context, from thinking, for example, on personal letters from Elephantine, there are a few passages there that read, these are parents writing to children or even slave owners writing to their slaves. And entire passages that can read as wisdom texts, but these are context-wise, who knows, maybe they are citing a certain well-known wisdom text, but these are the context-wise. I would bet that that these are just tips that they provide their children or their slaves in a different case. But they can read outside. If you don't know the context, if you just have a fragment, they can read as wisdom text, for example. So that's another consideration.
Yeah, I thought I actually did go through at least all of the Cowley texts, but I can look again. There may be advice given or counsel given, but it's the form, of course, that makes something proverbial or a traditional saying, in addition to trying to find parallels somewhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree, but some of them really read like, almost like they're taken out of Afrikaans, although they're not.
Okay, if I ever publish this, I will look again. Thank you.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Okay, thank you.
I want to invite the next presenter, Brian Garner, Leiden University, that will talk about literary composition on Greek and Phoenician inscriptions, recovering the poetic from the epigraphic.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'd like to thank the organizers of this workshop and colleagues who joined our weekly group on recovering Phoenician poetry. But I'm particularly grateful for having had the opportunity to work with Andrea and Noam and Noga. I may be the only one presenting on the specific Phoenician inscriptions that we studied, but I'm shamelessly borrowing or stealing from the others. And I don't hold them responsible for anything infelicitous. Give them any credit, I'll take the blame. Do note that I tend to find the poetic where they only see the literary. The text that I'll show should be legible, but this QR code will let you follow along on your phone or another screen. I don't have a handout, but that could be your handout. You can magnify it now or save it for later, memento. My goal here is to set Greek inscriptions that are literary and poetic next to Phoenician poetic literary inscriptions. These are Phoenician and Greek because of their language and their alphabetic scripts. They're Phoenician and Greek because of their religious context, preserving votive, dedicatory, funerary rituals. They name their gods, they name their cities, their ancestors. But I want to focus on their qualitative similarities, how they are poetic, how they are similar, rather than on quantitative differences, how poetic they are or not. Let's admit right now, in the case of epigraphy, the Phoenicians and the Greek are not very poetic at all. Although remnants of hexameter can be found in the Greek text, we cannot use them to reverse engineer Homer. In the same way, the poetic remnants in the Phoenician text cannot help us to restore a Canaanite epic. Still, these Greek and Phoenician inscriptions stood in similar contexts. Their use of alphabetic scripts were remarkably similar, and they use similar semantic building blocks, including poetic cola. Let's start with an early text or pair of texts that are not poetry, but they do have poetic elements. You might note that the scripts themselves are adornments, written boustrophodon, turning back and forth as the ox plows. And they are punctuated to aid the reader, mark word and sense breaks. The text above, presumably written first, was written in the Ionian alphabetic script. Below, in a different hand, an Attic script. This early archaic dedication marks a transition in control over the town of Sigean and the Hellespont at the moment around 550 BC, when Athens began to colonize the area and control the grain routes to and from the Black Sea. The script above, that dialect, was presumably mutually intelligible with the second, yet the second was deemed necessary to assert Athenian identity in a multilingual or multidialectal environment. The inscription was used to later used as a bench. So now, as you see, it's a little bit hard to read. Fortunately, it was drawn beforehand. The text asserts that its own ego, its own self, the stone, speaks. The I, the ego of the inscription, is tripartite, divided by punctuation. I am a bowl, a stand, and a strainer. Made explicit in the lower inscription, but the speaking stone commemorates the dedicant phoneticos, then has a shift to the third person as he gives. And it commemorated the recipient, the prytany of Sijan. I'm presenting the text here by clause, by units of syntax. All the texts I'm going to present in that way. The semantic rhythmical patterns are clear that way. The Athenian version includes two clauses, the lower version. One with a mild general conditional curse, and another naming the craftsman who created me, the bowl, the stand, and the strainer. Also in the Athenian version, the dedication is renamed in near poetic parallel as a memorial, as a mnema. Catherine Kiesling has noted or called this the mnema function, one that sets the dedicant in relation to their community in competitive display, the social memorial function of the dedication. Not poetry, but the Boustrophidan scripts engage the reader. They have first-person narrative and repetition of the dedication in near parallel. Those are all poetic flourishes. The second Greek dedication, again, Boustrophidan, running up and then down the armrest of a seated figure, is again not poetry. The ego of this inscription is both the object, the statue, and the person represented. I am Chares. There are four necessary elements that, as Joseph Day has noted, appear in these votive dedications. There's the name dedicator with optional genealogy, a verb for the active dedication, that's 2. Here it's a static verb. The divine recipient, that's 3, with optional epithet, and a term for the dedication itself, here an agalma. Oops. This is the second of Catherine Kiesling's functional categories for dedications. An agalma function sets the elite dedicant in relation to the divinity, in reciprocity. The religious adornment function of the dedication, or it's the religious adornment function of the dedication. It's not poetry, but the Boustrophidan script in rows as the ox plows, engaging the reader, and the first-person narrative, where the statue, the dedicant speaks, I am Chares, are poetic. This Boustrophidan script, however, is poetic. Running up and down his legs, it's again an adornment. Yeah, now finally poetic. Note that it's a century prior to our previous two. The named dedicator acts, makes the dedication of me. The ego here is the statue itself, either representing Manticolus or Apollo, the divine recipient. And in near parallel, the me is a tithe. This scans in hexameter in 2 or 3 formulaic rhythmical cola. The required semantic units fall into these rhythmical units. But where did the Greeks develop their use of alphabetic script for the mnema function, for memorial, and the agalma function for adornment? What about the poetry and rhythmical units as an adornment? I would argue that they borrowed the use of alphabetic script for adornment and memorial from the same source that they borrowed the scripts themselves, from the Phoenicians. The dedication of Elval follows the contours of the statue. Not true Boustrophidan, but an adornment nonetheless, like a pectoral, And the cartouche of Asorcon dates the statue to around 900 BC. The Phoenician dedicatory formula commonly start with a noun clause. This is an effigy. There is no ego here, but one might as well translate the predicate nominative as I am an effigy of Elabal, repurposing the Egyptian statue, if he's naming this as himself. It was a full statue. There are pieces of it, other pieces of it together that I didn't show you. Or it could be, I am an effigy of Asorcon. But the following clauses, divided by syntax here, have a certain rhythm and assonance due to the repetition of the city name. And I've set them in 3 bicolor to indicate their rhythm, but it's just my punctuation. I don't think I can convince the others in my group that this is poetry, but I am claiming that these syntax units are poetic. The statue is a memorial. It has a mnema function. It is an adornment, has an agalma function, particularly recording the reciprocal relationship with the divine. I would admit that the first-person narrative I posit for this is a stretch, because the first-person narrative on Greek inscriptions is poetic and much more explicit. As the dedication of Panamuis demonstrates. This is a stone with a voice. Panamuis is mentioned almost parenthetically. All 4 elements are here: the dedicant, the action, the dedication, the deity, but the stone is asked to use its voice and tell in near poetic parallel, or to speak. The stone is parallel to the altar and to the tithe. Apollo is in parallel to the god. It's not only written in epigrammatic verse, but it has poetic repetition. And also note the use of deixis, indicating the altar, this altar here. This type of first-person narrative, explicitly giving voice to the stone, may appear only in Greek, but poetic parallelism and deixis do appear in Phoenician. My objective here is comparison. And bilingual dedications across the Mediterranean, for example, Cyprus, demonstrate how the form and function of dedicatory inscriptions are comparable. As do these duplicate, I have a double, that doubled up. As do these duplicate bilingual inscriptions from Malta and on acanthus wrapped balusters. Both are dedicated to founder Heracles Melkart, but the dedication itself is unnamed. The Archigetes, the founder, Apollo, is normally Apollo and found in Naxos and on Cyrene. And on Cyrene, they have these Aegeus acanthus wrapped columns and doorways. So this is kind of a cultural mixture on this inscription. The name dedicators are translated. The name deity is translated. The act is present, but the act is present in Phoenician only and implied in the Greek. But that shows just having those 2 texts parallel to each other, both having the same elements in Greek and Phoenician, is significant in showing the parallelism. This is an Acropolis shrine. This is from an Acropolis shrine to Aphrodite Pandemus, or Astarte in Phoenician. It's near Stoichidon, lined up like a courier font, right on top of each other. Only punctuation marks are at the end of the line of the epigram, the hexameter and the pentameter. To my knowledge, this is the only dedication with a curse, a rare but relatively common feature in Phoenician. Poetic figurative language. There's poetic figurative language in blessings and curses on Phoenician inscriptions like this. The curse has a poetic cognate, again, more common on Phoenician. as for whoever claims a claim falsely. So that cognate is and the curse itself. It's a pretty flimsy foundation to build upon, but I would argue that these features indicate that this was a dedication by a Phoenician resident alien in Athens. My colleagues in our group might not concur with this sort of wild claim, but there you have it. I'm going to conclude with two Phoenician inscriptions that I would argue are poetic, if not poetry. And we've seen this twice already. This is the Kulamua inscription. They have the four elements that Day has noticed that Greek dedications require. And Day himself cites the Phoenicians as precedent. They serve the mnema function of a memorial and a galma function as an adornment. They both have an ego that may refer to an image of the ruler in low relief, here on the top left, on each inscription, and they both have a certain rhythm and formulaic regularity. We've already heard about this 9th century dedication of Kulamua. Collins has called this poetry. O'Connor just calls it rhetorical. I'm in the poetry camp. I think my colleagues are more in the rhetorical camp. And we just heard the proverbs were described as rhetorical, maybe not poetic. But the figurative and language in these curses and in these inscriptions, okay, I'm going to argue are part of the poetry. So we have near parallels. We have in the first, I've kind of divided this up myself, but it matches the divisions that Collins and O'Connor made. I'm treating these as cola. It starts with an ego. It does have Aramaic elements. Instead of ben, it's bar or kilamua. But then the tricola and bicola start below. So I have an example that was already mentioned, but these types of examples. But we have the hand is then repeated in near parallel in the other figurative language, that the hand that tried to swallow him up was the hand of the kings, and a fire that consumes the beard, and the fire that consumes the hand. That's all. These are all this figurative language and these near parallels, and the way that they fall into semantic cola, I think, are evidence of the poetic. There's also repetition and near parallelism below in the at least semantic parallels, in the way that the one never gazing upon the face of a lamb is made master, one never gazing upon the face of an ox is made a master. And there's a shift, but the semantic parallel maintains through the byssus or the linen that covers him. And then it returns to the hand again in figurative language of their spirit becoming like the spirit of an orphan towards its mother. And all of these bicola and tricola, all of these repetitive patterns and all this figurative language, to me, are clear indications of the poetic. And let me end with the inscription of Yehumilk from Byblos. Well, actually, before I do that, the adornment of the previous inscription was the raised lettering was part of the adornment. It obviously was a memorial of his actions. And in this case in the case of the Yehumilk inscription, in the same way that Collins called the Kulamua inscription poetic, Gerhard Fecht has called this inscription poetic, and he's broken it into cola independently of me that are very similar to the way that I've broken it up in semantic units. So it begins with the ego again. The image of Yehu Milk is at the top of the inscription, approaching the throne deity, assumed to be Yehu Milk. Here, there's a reciprocity that's emphasized. The mistress has given. It seems that his grandfather was king of Byblos, but his father was not. So it seems that the mistress has granted him the kingship again. So that's what she gave him. She made him king over Byblos. So what he did was, after he prayed to her, and she heard his voice. So now he's making the following. I make the following for my mistress. So she gave so that he gives the do ut des, or she made, so now he's making. And then there's a rhythmical list of the objects that are dedicated in semantic parallel. Not only are they semantic parallel, but they're also, again, deictic, where you're pointing. This is the altar of bronze. This is in my courtyard. This is in the gateway. Above which, oops. Which is above the front of my gateway. This is a winged disc of gold. So it's continually deictic, demonstrative, and it begins and ends in a framing composition with what Yehu Milk is doing. I gave, or I made. I made what follows, and at the end he says, I made what I just listed. But it's also has a distant parallel with a repetition again in the curse portion of the inscription of all of the elements that he's dedicated. So again, we see the altar, the gateway, and the portico. And in the what is being preserved is the memory. Mine is the name, Yehu Milk. Mine is the name Yehu Milk, king of Byblos, and this has been repeated throughout. So the mnema function, the memorial function, is consistent throughout this. The adornments that he's indicating are consistent throughout this. Why Greek? Why am I comparing this to Greek? The Greek comes after, but I think it follows in a tradition of use of alphabetic script. The 4 elements of these dedications. The name dedicant, the deity, the action, and the dedication. The memorial and adornment functions, and the poetic elements. Now, the poetic elements, my colleagues may not follow me here in my conclusion, but what are the poetic elements? How many together make poetry? To make it may not be good, it could even be doggerel, but how do we quantify this? Or do we just know it when we see it? Poetry on dedications, lousy poetry, when is it enough? If you have cognates, if you have figurative language, maybe not. If you have extensive regular epithets, maybe not. Long genealogies, deixis, maybe not. But combine all of those together, they might not be enough, but combine all those together with repetition and parallelism, near and distant, semantic and rhythmical cola. These are the formal characteristics of poetry, and I think we see these on the Phoenician inscriptions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I remember many years ago, Professor Itzhak Avishur wrote about the vertical constructions in Phoenician and Ugaritic and the Bible. Yes. Many questions, please? Yes.
Hi, thanks, Brian. As you know, I don't really know a whole lot about the philology or certainly about poetry or anything, but I'm struck, and because I have done some work on the metal bowls that get that have inscriptions on them. So from sort of 10th through 7th centuries, let's say I am the bowl of, and sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's not, and they're all in a variety of different languages, right? Greek, Phoenician, Luvian, Cypro-Minoan. So there's a lot of the same idea of kind of the way in which the material is embodied with the memory and the person. And I wonder just, and you started to get at it with the raised lettering for the Kilimua as adornment, but how the actual material that these are on are also part of that poetic aspect. I feel like there's a way to think about poetry there.
Well, I did in the Elibal inscription with the curving on like a pictorial. But it's not the problem in the Phoenician is that we don't have that many examples where the object is speaking. We have examples where the king is depicted and it says I am, but we don't have the bowl speaking in Phoenician. I wish we couldn't.
But I guess
But I know that this is part of the system, and that's what I'm saying is that
Exactly.
this is part of the system.
Exactly.
And that it's shared, or there must be precedents in Phoenician for this type of thought. But when it comes to the adornment, there are some inscriptions that have very beautiful script, very well written, and others that are very hastily done.
But not
So
even
it's
just
hard.
not even just the script, but the actual material it's on itself. I mean, sort of its physical presence as durable material. I wonder.
I mean, that is part of the adornment. I think that's part of the adornment element.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I was very impressed with the Greek material, and I agree that the Kilimua inscription, has what you could call, poetic sections. But one of the things that characterize parallelism in West Semitic verse is that you have more or less a uniformity of line length, forming couplets or sometimes triplets, and sometimes duplets. Okay, but you don't really have that very much in Kilimua. You have it in a few places. You don't have it in Yechelno, in much of what you showed. I just want to make a different kind of point. The dedication formula that you showed in Phoenician, which has many parallels, also in Ugaritic, also in Aramaic. The length of, there are different sections that all follow a particular sequence. And if the details are longer, then that particular line is longer. You don't have balance in general in that kind of formula. Now, in this particular inscription from the 5th century in Yechelnok's inscription, but I think you may have done a little bit of tuning by saying this is the, this is the bronze altar, this is the etc. Because in the way I understand it, it says I made this bronze altar and etc. It's extremely prosaic. Not only do you have the syntax adding phrase after phrase after phrase, but you have relative pronouns, which are very rare in West Semitic poetry, to have these relative clauses, incorporated into the text. And if you compare biblical Hebrew poetry, at least in early poetry, although this is such an early period, but in early biblical poetry, of course, you have very little use of the determinative hey. You have very little use of the relative pronoun, and you have very little use of the note accusativi, which you also have in this inscription. So I find that it's quite a stretch to look for poetry in this particular inscription.
Well, my point was not just that it's the semantic pattern that gets repeated over and over again of about the same length. And I agree. The reason why I'm cheating a little bit is that the main clause at the beginning, which is I made this, and the main clause at the end, I made this frame this section, and this section matches with the article and the object, followed by a relative clause. matches all other Phoenician dedicatory inscriptions where these are independent. So I didn't mean to, I am kind of forcing it by making these independent clauses. But the force of the tradition, I think I'm cheating, but only a little bit, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. On this figura that from rhetorics of poetics I would use the term of the object speaking that you mentioned also. There's a truly magnificent book by Jens Svenborg.
Yeah.
Classical.
Frasiclea.
But you got exactly on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for stimulating paper. But I need to say a couple of things. One, the raised script of Kulamua is part and parcel.
It's
of
Luwian. Yeah.
Well, it's mimicking the Luwian, but it's also part of the Grabdenkmäler of Samael. All of these inscriptions are raised script, including a non-royal inscription like Katamua. And Katamua is interesting as a follow-up because this issue of the Napsh in the stela, and hence speaking. So there's a lot going on. I'm with others. I'm not convinced that I think you have to prove really the difference between highly rhetorical and poetic.
Well,
And that's where I think the rubber meets the road.
I'm expanding the ick. My colleagues focus on the poetry,
Yeah.
and I'm kind of expanding the ick. I'm embracing the ick.
Okay.
It sounds like something
Okay.
that hip kids are saying these days. but,
Okay, then poetic is the same as rhetorical.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
In that case, no problem, because most of your West Semitic inscriptions are highly rhetorical. I mean, you can look at Mesha, for instance, and it's extremely rhetorical. But it's not poetry.
Hey, Brian, thank you. Here. The question, I think what can be very useful in the direction that you are going is to add some theoretical discussion about poetry, because the question is what is poetry is not an easy one. One can come from the Aristotle perspective that the main thing is the form, and I think some of the notes that you received here are coming from the direction of the form. But if we take in, for example, Roman Jakobson attitude, which is coming mainly from the function, and I think you're struggling with these two issues, because if we're coming from the function, I think that what you're saying is right. There is a poetic function here, but we have to do a separation between the question of the form, or to deal with the relationship between the form and the poetic form and the poetic function.
Can I follow up the point that was just made? Can I follow up the point that was just made by asking a different sort of question? I'd like to ask you, why does poetry matter? In other words, why is it so important for it to be poetry? The reason I'm asking this, at least some people have proposed, in the Greek world of the 6th and 5th century, the movement from poetry to prose was an important aspect of her intellectual development and change. Therefore, the question of why does poetry matter, and what does poetry say about the way people think about themselves and about the world, is, I think, potentially a very important issue that needs to be addressed.
I think that's at the core of what the core of my motivation is to give poetry to the Phoenicians because it's been denied them. So maybe I'm overcompensating. So, but that's for those very reasons, like the why express yourself in poetry. I think every society expresses himself in poetry. They've write love poems to each other. They write epics. What we don't have, the literary tradition that survives in Phoenician. So how do we, the whole point of our group was, how do we recover poetry if we start from that assumption? And so that was kind of the working basis of our group. So that's why we went this way, or I went this way.
The last two questions. We need to go on to the next paper. Yes. One.
Just to follow up on Galit's comment on Jaspar Svenbro, the point of Frasiclea creates a major distinction between the two categories of inscriptions you've presented, because if it's not Mantiklos who is speaking, it's the object that is speaking. And it is speaking in a way like we push the play button on a remote. Namely, you see it and it talks to you. It provides a very different ambiance of poetic function in this type of representation. It diminishes the role of I am the king. No, there's no king there. It's the object that's speaking. And it's true for the Simonides, for example, epigram after the Battle of the 300. It's true for the majority of funerary stele in the Kerameikos and so on. So it's okay to make that comparison, but in a sense, poetically to distinguish between the two, a priori, I think is very important.
Yeah, I am trying to keep a distinction, but there is when it's a statue of someone and the statue says, I am that person. I don't think that Greek inscription is of the same type as the Frasiclea.
It doesn't say I'm that person. It say Menasithales dedicated me to the Oikistes. Mantiklos dedicated me. It's the me who's talking, not.
Yeah. No, I agree. I'm just trying to find whether people have made that something like the genius of the Greeks. That's part of that idea of the speaking stone is something uniquely Greek, and I'm okay to keep it uniquely Greek. But there is a sense that you're like you were saying, there is a sense that you reactivate by speaking. Right. You're going to speak it aloud when you see it. That's part of Frasiclea too, is that you're going to read aloud what you say.
And I think you showed that it's not unique to Greek.
But but you can these texts, if you're reading them aloud, it has a similar function. So I'm willing to keep that a separate category at the same time to say it has that reinvigorating the inscription by speaking it aloud again.
Okay, the last short question.
I'll keep it short because I think I might have a partial answer to why poetry. And I'll just give an example of from my own experience, which is that I can sing along with a song that I heard in 4th grade, and yet I can't remember what I ate for breakfast. So I think it has to do with, and if the stone itself is singing as people approach, it's something about memory and about repetition and about the ancestors and the transition, at least if it's in a death context, from the living to the dead, but keeping the memories alive by singing them, by reciting them and remembering them, because it's much easier if it's poetry or song than if it's prose.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Andrea Rothstein from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, that will talk about Birsa, the upside story, and the foundation of Carthage.
I begin with an empty space. The space of the stories that were told and the songs that were sung in Carthage and were never written down, or if they were, they are forever lost to us. The absence of evidence, though, is not evidence of absence. I cannot judge the empty space from the vantage viewpoint of hypertextualized cultures. We have over 200,000 ancient Greek inscriptions, as opposed to about 10 or 12,000 Phoenician or Punic ones. I will be using mostly the term Phoenician from now on. Geographically, the Greek corpus is spread. The range of epigraphic genres is very broad, and it all comes accompanied by a substantial manuscript tradition. In contrast, the Phoenician epigraphical corpus derives from much fewer excavated sites, often lacking chronological continuity. It is rather poor before the 5th century BCE and is largely dominated by formulaic, funerary, and votive inscriptions from a single site, the Tophet in Carthage. We must work with indirect evidence, and so I will. The term Byrsa refers up to date to the hill on which the citadel of Carthage was built, a settlement that began, according to the archaeological record, sometime before 800 BCE. Byrsa is a Greek term, first attested in Herodotus. It means, number 1 in your handout, the skin stripped off of an animal, hide, oxhide, leather. Why was the hill named Byrsa? Answers come from Greek and Latin sources. The well-known story tells that the Phoenician newcomers were allowed to get as much land as could be covered by a bull's hide. A single oxhide was then cut into thin strips, allowing to encircle the area that was to become the Acropolis of Carthage. It was called Byrsa because the Greek name means oxide. This story has the hallmark of a trickster folk motif. If it substantiates causality by similarity of sound, a typical habit of thought in antiquity. For all we know, the name of the place may have motivated the story. What is then in the name? The Greek word Byrsa is considered of Indo-European origin, number 2, but that is of little consequence to us. The question, why is this hill called Byrsa, must have been first posed in Carthage and must have been answered in Phoenician. We don't know what the local name was. We only know its Greek rendition. A few modern etymologies have been suggested, number 3. To find the original name of the hill, we have to look for a Phoenician word that, to Greek ears, would sound like Byrsa, one that is consistent with Phoenician toponyms, which are often concrete and descriptive, such as rock, Tsur, for the city of Tyre, also Sela, this Greek Soli, Fens, Gadera, Gadir, Gades, the weaving mill, Hamtu, in Greek, Motia. The simplest option would be the root Bet Tzadi Reish, Betzer, fortress. Betzer or Botzra are known ancient toponyms. This option has often been rejected because it requires the transposition of sound between the sibilant and the liquid, Botzra or Bosra and Birsa. Popular or pseudo etymology, however, does not follow strict rules of phonological derivation. Affinity of sound may be enough to trigger a connection and generate a story. Bosra, the traditional view regarding the name of the Byrsa hill, leaves us with an open question. If the original name has nothing to do with leather, is the story entirely a Greek invention, as it is usually held? Number 4, for example. Today I will argue that the story about the oxide trick goes back to Carthage itself and was actually promoted by Roman authors. I will conclude by trying to envision what could have prompted the oxide story in relation to the Bosra hill. Greek sources on the foundation of Carthage are scanty. They are all fragments, that is, citations from later authors. Except from one testimony, they belong to the genre of chronography. Now, chronicles list events in chronological order, adding bits and pieces of information such as the foundation of cities and battles. The Greek chronographic sources regarding the foundation of Carthage are revealing beyond dating. We learn from Josephus, citing Menander of Ephesus, for number 5a, that certain Tyrian records were translated into Greek. These records seem to have been structured as a list of Tyrian kings. They give a specific year for the foundation of Carthage, number 5b, the 7th year of Pygmalion's reign, when his sister escaped from him. Josephus probably used the chronicle compiled by Eusebius, which we know from Jerome's translation into Latin. In this chronicle, number 5c, there are 4 different entries for the foundation of Carthage, and as there are alternative dates, there are also alternative founders, Zor and Carthago, eponyms derived from metropolis and colony. Thus far, our Greek sources reveal that there was a tradition, probably originating from Tyrian records, in which the sister of King Pygmalion left Tyre and founded Carthage. No Byrsa. A narrative account emerges in a late text known as the Treatise on Women, number 6, a text of uncertain date, an unknown author that offers 14 short biographies of famous women. One of them is Theioso, an ad hoc translation of the name Elisa, with the name Dido appearing as a Libyan coinage. The source cited, at least for the first part of the entry, is Timaeus of Tauromenium, a Sicilian chronographer and historian active in the 4th century BCE. The treatise offers what appears to be a summary of a longer narrative: Elisa's loss of her husband at her brother's hands, the flight to the west carrying her husband's wealth, the king of Libya wanting to marry Elisa, her suicide under pretense of performing a ritual to avoid the marriage. This is the earliest narrative account of Elisa's or Dido's story and the foundation of Carthage. The kind of detail suggests that it is based on a longer novelistic account of the sort we often find in ancient historiography as early as Herodotus. There is no reference to the Byrsa or to how the land of Carthage was acquired. For longer versions, we need to turn to Latin sources, the locus classicus being Virgil's Aeneid. Book 1. Aeneas is fleeing from Troy to the west, to a land called Hesperia. Juno provokes a storm, and the Trojans are deviated to African shores. Aeneas, a Trojan refugee and now a shipwreck survivor, is about to reach a city. His mother, the goddess Venus, disguised as some sort of Amazon, greets him and explains that they have arrived to a Punic kingdom, led by Dido, whose brother Pygmalion had killed her husband. Venus concludes, number 7, Dido began to prepare her flight and her allies. Ships that by chance were ready, they seize and load with gold. The wealth of greedy Pygmalion is carried over the sea. A woman is chief of the deed. They arrive to the place where now you can see huge walls and the racing citadel of the new Carthage, pun intended. They purchase the ground, the Byrsa, from the deed's name, as much ground as they could enclose with the back of a bull. This, the most famous account of the foundation of Carthage, is delivered by a divine character in disguise. It has a novelistic flavor, a little epic within the epic poem, similar enough to Timaeus, though it emphasizes greed and gold and describes the deceit that pays for the land. Besides Virgil, 2 writers under Augustus, Strabo and Velleius Paterculus, deal briefly with the foundation of Carthage without mentioning the Byrsa. Livy, in contrast, a roughly contemporary of Virgil, brings us back in time to the early 2nd century BCE. The year is 193 BCE. main actors are Carthage and their neighboring kingdom, the Numidians. In the background, Rome and Antioch. At some point after the second war between Rome and Carthage, the Numidians invaded the Emporia, an area that had so far paid tribute to Carthage. Carthage appeals to Rome for arbitration. The Numidians too send an embassy to Rome. Key to the dispute was the interpretation of the conditions that Scipio had stipulated after defeating Hannibal. The Carthaginians, according to the historian Polybius, were to restore to King Massinissa all land that had belonged to him or to his ancestors. To support their claim, Numidian ambassadors say, number 9, what land in Africa belongs to the Carthaginians? To the foreigners, that much was given by request in order to fortify a city, as they could enclose with the cut back of a bull. Whatever that they took beyond the Birsa, their own side, they got by force and wrongdoing. The use of the Birsa story in a diplomatic speech is illuminating. This was an official appeal to the Roman Senate. The story of the Birsa supports the notion that nothing but the citadel belongs to Carthage, almost a legitimate transaction. And so the oxide motif is appropriated by the enemies of Carthage. Could the king of Numidia himself be the source? Massinissa, after all, grew up in Carthage as a hostage. Hostages were used in the ancient world as guarantee for the fulfillment of agreements. He was educated in Carthaginian ways, married a Carthaginian woman, and even fought for Carthage against Rome until he joined Rome and went on to rule as a vassal king for over 50 years. If the speech reported by Livy goes back to Massinissa, could this be a detail in a story that he learned as a boy in Carthage? If so, the reference to the Birsa in diplomatic argumentation suggests that rather than a Greek tale, this was part of the Carthaginian lore. So far we have seen that the Tyrian princess, founder of Carthage, was mentioned in the Tyrian records, but the tale of the oxide is absent from Greek sources. The Numidian embassy of 193 BCE, reported by Livy, is the earliest witness of the Birsa story, which through Massinissa may go back to Carthaginian tradition. Timaeus summed up a longer narrative without mentioning the oxide. Virgil probably knew the same source, but mentioned the Birsa. Our last testimony can show us what that longer narrative would have looked like. Justin, the 2nd century CE Latin historian, epitomized a long work by a 3rd century BCE historian, Pompeius Trogus. Justin's description of the intrigues in the Tyrian palace is worth reading in detail, but I fast forward to the political assassination of Elisa's husband. Deceiving her brother Pygmalion, Elisa goes into exile with some members of the aristocracy, taking his dead husband's hidden gold. After a step in Cyprus, they arrived to African shores. According to Justin, the natives were actually happy at the prospect of trade. Then, number 10, having purchased a place as much as could be covered with an oxide, she, Elisa, directed the leather to be cut into the thinnest possible strips, and thus occupied a greater portion of ground than she had demanded, whence the place had afterwards the name of Birsa. Justin goes on. The native neighboring people and the settlers from Utica persuaded the Tyrian newcomers to build a city, a permanent settlement. An annual tribute was set as payment for the land. With everyone's consent, Carthage was founded, while an annual tribute was established for the city's ground. That was a citation. The city was located, so Justin goes on, at the spot where the head of a horse was found, a portent known to Virgil too. In the final act of the drama, Elisa commits suicide to avoid marrying the local king. Justin concludes by saying that as long as Carthage remained, Elisa was worshipped as a goddess. Justin's account is extensive, full of dramatic detail, direct speech adding liveliness to the account. The foundation of Carthage is described in two steps. First, the Byrsa as a trading post, then the city itself. The land was acquired in two ways. First, by cutting the oxide. Second, by consensus and a lawful payment of rent. A story of deception followed by one of cooperation. Two objects are emblematic of each story, the oxide and the horse's head. To me, it seems that two narratives have been stitched together. And it is striking that the Latin testimonies converge towards the end of the Roman Republic. Livy, Virgil, Trogus. Carthage was refounded in 44 BCE, but the real building of the Colonia Julia Augusta started after 15 BCE. Augustus built on the center of the Punic city. The Byrsa hill was leveled and became Roman Carthage. Could the rebuilding of the city have promoted a new interest in foundation stories? In any case, what is clear is that although the oxide story is based on Greek etymology, it was only known and promoted by Roman authors. But it wasn't a Roman tale, as it wasn't a Greek tale. Faint echoes of a legend belonging to the Phoenician sphere come from the Tyrian records registering Elisa's foundation of Carthage, and from the Numidians knowing of the oxide through Massinissa. Thus far, I've done what I've been trained to do. Beyond this, there is little we can do using philological and inductive methods. However, we can make inferences. There was a cult of Elisa in Carthage, according to Justin. Could the oxide story have been told in relation to that cult? Was that ritual, any ritual for that matter, performed in silence? No storytelling, no hymns, no songs? Greek and Roman sources echo something they might have heard from bilingual speakers or read in translation, but we can't prove there was a Punic song on Elisa. Back to the beginning. My analysis of the oxide story across Greek and Roman sources has not answered the question, what could have prompted a connection between the actual name of the hill, Betzero, Botsra, Bosra, and a bull hide? I will answer by moving into a somewhat unstable territory. Ancient etiologies work by association. An homonym of the Hebrew Betzero or Botsra, fortress, is Betzer, a word referring to precious metal, probably gold, found only in the book of Job. In our sources, gold is actually a recurrent motif. One could attribute this to a stereotype, but gold plays a crucial narrative role. It was hidden by Elisa's husband, coveted by her brother, carried on Elisa's ships. To a Phoenician speaker, the hill's name Botsra, fortress, could sound close to Betzer, gold, close enough to become an ideology. Greek speakers only heard Byrsa, leather. Phoenician Greek bilinguals would hear both, leather and gold. I will end by suggesting a way of connecting cattle hides with precious metal. It is horrendously speculative for a philologist like me, but terribly compelling, and I am almost done. There is a type of object typical of the Bronze Age Mediterranean that is a carrier of value, traveled by maritime transport and looks like cattle hide. Metal blocks weighing 20 to 40 kilograms that were a means for transporting copper and tin. Scholarly literature calls them oxide ingots. We don't know how the ancients called them, but the oxide appearance couldn't have escaped them. Metal ingots are sometimes represented in scenes of tribute, as in Egypt, bronze stands, and even as votives in miniature forms. Two statuettes standing on ingots may represent divinities, sometimes called by scholars the ingot god and Ashtart of the ingot. These so-called oxide ingots survive in astonishing number until the end of the first millennium, but I understand that there are no exemplars of the 9th century BCE. Until the end of the second millennium, thank you, yes. I understand that there are no exemplars of the 9th century BCE. If there were, one could imagine the representation of a metal ingot in the shape of a cattle hide in iconography related to the public cult of Elisa in Carthage. Elisa's stop in Cyprus, a main area of production, would suddenly make sense. If eventually the metal nature of the ingot was forgotten and it was perceived as an animal oxide, the stage would be set for a Greek speaker to ask, how could a single oxide be enough to pay for the hill? I began with an open space, the space of the stories that were told and the songs that were sung in Carthage and were never written down, or if they were, they are forever lost to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Question? Yes, one. There are two here. Three. One.
A short remark about the oxide ingot. The first type of oxide ingot was found in the shipwreck Ulumburum, 1200 BC. So
Yes,
this predates the Phoenicians.
I know, but it's a long story until the end of the second millennium.
And also it was here in Israel.
Pretty close, but not close enough.
And also in Israel we found the oxide ingot, the Megadim.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Fascinating paper. And I have some first millennium representations of oxide ingots, even though we don't have the ingots themselves. So I believe there are some on the gates of Balawat. Perhaps Danielle could help me out here with, if I'm remembering correctly, stop please, Phoenicians carrying ingot-shaped or oxide ingot-shaped things as tribute to the Assyrians. Mama? Okay. Regardless, it does exist in the first millennium. Okay. And then the second example, in a temple space in Spain near Seville, help me out, Es El Colombo or something. Anyway, it's the wrong name, but it's there. There is in the floor of a temple that has a statuette in bronze with a dedication to Astarte. So we even know what she looks like because it has the representation of the goddess. In that temple, it's written, at least I haven't seen images, that there is an oxide ingot shaped
in the base.
Something, in the floor of the building. And then the final thought is that the story in Justin sort of rings somewhat true following archaeology because it's Utica that's been shown through archaeology that settled first. Mm-hmm. So that's the area of Carthage that has the initial settlement. And so if there was somebody fleeing, let's say from the east, they would have come to a place where Levantines, Phoenicians, whatever you want to call them, had already settled. And so from there, from that safety, then the next step would be to purchase the hill for a fortress. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later about all the references. Thank you.
I was always struck by this very un-Greek story, because when Greeks founded colonies or a new city, unlike the Latin notion of the pomerium, they didn't have it. I mean, before Alexander the Great, and there's a story about the birds taking the seeds, but he's trying to draw the contours of the city. There's no a priori notion of a city's territory. There's certainly notion of the center. At least that's where people congregate. But the whole idea of encircling a territory with anything is more apt. In the Greek world, I can only think of dedicating a temenos with woolen fillets. It's studied by Georg Hock already from 1905. But other than that, it must be very late still. When the Mediterranean is already a mishmash of Roman, Hellenistic, Greek notions and stories about how to found a city. It sounds more like a Roman story to me than anything else.
You are not alone.
Any more questions? Here.
In Virgil, in the Greek, in the English translation you handed out, it says they purchased the ground, the Birsa, from the deed's name.
That's like an editorial edition of the narrator in Virgil.
This couldn't be a clue, maybe, what Birsa might have meant.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that's the classic, that's the ideology. The ideology works in Greek, and Virgil uses the Greek word in the Latin poem. But yeah, it paraphrases in a way the name in Greek. Penina, can we turn on the lights? I am totally.
I'm wondering, one, about the etymology of Birsa. If it's only a later adaptation, Birsa, that it is Greek, and it goes to Oxide. Did you check if there is Berber or any African etymology or toponym that can fit the original name?
I tried, but I didn't go too far.
Okay.
In the scholarly literature, nobody has an answer for that, for a native name.
No. Another wondering, if I understand correctly, Elisa, you connected with Cyprus and
it's not me, it's Justin. He says that he left she left Tyre. They had a little stop in Cyprus. They took some women hostages for brides, and they went on. And to me, this stop is
okay, now, if
a question, yeah.
If Elisa has to do with Cyprus, and that was the earlier name of the island, it has really 12th century BCE memory. You understand?
I'm not sure.
Elisha.
Alashia.
Yeah.
That's the earlier name of the island.
Yeah, that connection is often made about the name of the one who we call Dido, but the tradition calls mostly Elisha. Yeah, but that's a good point. Yeah.
The second microphone to her. Is the last question.
One reference, maritime reference again. Both Ashkelon ships, the Phoenician ships that were found offshore Ashkelon, dated to the 8th century, and they were on the way to Carthage. One of them was named Elisha, and the other one Tanit.
But that's modern. The excavator gave those names to those ships. And they're not off Ashkelon, they're really off the north coast of Egypt, so no offense.
I just, if I may say a last thing, I am trying to use material culture to try to flesh out the story, for which we have very little, and we tend to see it through Greek lenses. And so I'm not sure if I am doing a good job, but I want to look at it as if it came from a Phoenician Punic context. No, I.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Lunch is shortened, we will be back at 2. Aaron?
Yes. I know the shipwrecks. I know that.
No. I heard it before, but.
Hi, Ian, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're the Dutch person. Good, I just did
Fantastic. Okay, so you should now be able to share your screen and we can see if it works. It's the green
How do I
button
do?
in the middle of your options at the bottom.
So share at the bottom. So all I have to do is do. Okay, I haven't finished the PowerPoint yet.
Okay, 1 minute. I'll just wait until people have left to go to lunch, and then it will be a little bit quieter in here, and we can speak
You've
a
got an
little
English
more
accent.
easily.
I wish I was there. Actually, it sounds great. Okay. Good.
אבל יש לי גם את ה-PDF הזה, אני יכולה גם לשלוח עם עדיף. כן, שלח לי דין ואני אשלח חזרה. תודה רבה.
מה עושה להם בשני פרויקטים כרגע עד שמאשרים אבל אני גם עובד על השאלה מורית וגם משהו קדימה על מילת הנפיות הערבית שנקרא תימני עם אופרת וואלה, יש גם מחשבות אנחנו כמה מילים כי לקחתי את סושי. So now שני כללים.
He's got specific lines.
And try and get the